Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough. Thanks.
Hello, lovelies. This is the Sabbat book for 5th edition Vampire, and it is extremely disappointing on a number of levels. It was nearly £40, 40 of your British pounds, and it's not that far north of 100 pages. So that's one level of disappointment. Also, I think people often point to books like Strixhaven to say this is everything that is wrong with the current RPG industry. I don't necessarily think that's accurate, but the Sabbat book is perhaps everything that is wrong with the current RPG industry. I mean, it is a competently executed book. It has many of the foibles that the rest of the 5th edition Vampire books have, that may peeve a lot of people, including myself. The artistic presentation, I mean, it's skillful, it's just not what I want from a vampire book. I can overlook that. That's a matter of subjective taste. The problem is that it is gutless. It doesn't have the courage of its convictions. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but Vampire the Masquerade has always been about playing monsters. In the typical mode of play, you are playing a monster who is trying not to be a monster, or to keep their monstrous side under control. That's the default mode of play, because you're generally playing a Camarilla vampire. And the Camarilla believes that vampiric nature, the beast, can best be controlled through rules, regulations, enforcement, that kind of thing. It's a kind of prototypical conservative law and order sort of approach. But you're still a monster, and you're probably going to lose. The Sabbat embrace their vampiricness, and they try to find a different moral structure suited to their new way of being, as if they were an intelligent predator, which essentially they are. The Teknoaxe believe that humanity can best be expressed by embracing freedom and liberty. It's not that dissimilar to political ideas found in communism, say, or some strands of anarchism, where the idea is that it is society that turns people into shitty human beings, and that if you remove those restraints and you remove those problems with a lack of food or shelter or whatever, then people will naturally become better human beings. Hopelessly optimistic, but nice, right? But the Sabbat, it's all about, yeah, I'm a monster, I'm going to embrace that, I'm going to find a way to live with that. The Inconnu aren't really that worth mentioning, but they try to rise above it all by becoming essentially vampiric saints who completely embrace their humanity and achieve Golconda, a state of spiritual perfection. Yeah. But the Sabbat, I always found interesting on a moral grounds, because they come up with their own new moral systems, their own new philosophies, whereas the Camarilla and Vampire as a whole was written from a more sort of Judeo-Christian moral perspective. The Sabbat had a profusion of different philosophies that still let them control their beasts, but which acknowledged what they were. It was fascinating and part of the maturity that made Vampire the Masquerade such a big success. But even in the default mode of play, you were playing monsters. The reason this book pisses me off so much is that they have shied away from that. Now, when they were launching, there was some of the old edginess in some of the books. It seemed like they were embracing that, and no pun intended, and bringing it forward, but there was pushback from the current industry critics, which meant that we've ended up with a rather gutless product that really lacks the courage of its convictions. And to give them credit, they kind of signal this at the beginning of the book. Here is the most important sentence in this book. The function of the Sabbat in Vampire the Masquerade stories is to threaten the status quo. The presentation of the Sabbat for the 5th edition of Vampire is as antagonists. The Sword of Cain is undeniably a monstrous evil that even the kindred fear. A sect of vampire supremacists who set aside the perspectives of the still living, believing themselves to be more than mortals. Blah 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 blah. To be clear, there are no systems or suggestions included herein for portraying the Sabbat as a player character. This book includes discipline powers, details for Sabbat rituals, information on the paths of enlightenment, etc., with the intention that the storytellers will use them to create compelling stories around opposing the Sabbat, rather than playing the Sabbat. Look, shit or get off the pot. There is sufficient information here with a bit of work to play the Sabbat as protagonists rather than antagonists, but in shying away from having Sabbat Chronicles, Sabbat games, explicitly endorsed and encouraged, they've wussed out. And it does mean that there is more work for you if you want to run that kind of campaign. And this is particularly baffling from a story point of view, because as it turns out, the Sabbat were right. There are terrible, horrible elders out there. They have been manipulating everything behind the scenes. They are a threat to the kindred and the kind alike. So if anything, you would have expected a kind of post-Gehenna or mid-Gehenna version of Vampire to embrace the fact that the Sabbat were right, to swell their ranks and so on, to make them more playable, but no, that is not what we have here. And that's really, there's not a lot else to say, because that kind of says it all. It lacks the courage of its convictions. It lacks the courage that White Wolf had in the 90s, though not quite as much courage as we were perhaps led to believe. I did an interview with Mark Reinhagen, must be a couple of years back now, where he said that they really felt the pressure from the sort of censorious mob at the gate more than perhaps we thought they did. But even so, you had Black Dog Game Factory, you had Vagina Dentata on the cover of the Smitsi book. It didn't feel like they shied away. This, however, very much does, and other controversies that there have been around the new edition of Vampire very much feels like they have shied away. So does that mean they please old players? No. Does it mean they please the new players? No, because you can never please them. So why not? If you're going to be damned if you do and damned if you don't, you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, right? You might as well go full on and not hold back and ignore what they're trying to make you do, the things they're trying to make you censor and edit out. So why shy away from portraying the Sabbat as what they are, which is not actually evil, just different in the way that if you made an animal intelligent, a non-human animal intelligent, its morality would likely be very different to a human morality. Alright? And again, they were proven right. So there was a really an opportunity here to bring to its fullest expression that the Sabbat weren't evil, weren't wrong. They were right, that they just had a different approach, especially sort of post Gehenna. But it doesn't do any of that And while there is sufficient information here to run a Sabbat-oriented chronicle and to bring in Sabbat disciplines and so on, it's emblematic of running scared of the mob who don't want to let you express yourself in an artistic way. And why is this so particularly annoying and shit when it comes to Vampire and when it comes to the Sabbat book? Because this is an explicitly adult game dealing with horror and mature themes. You don't really need to put disclaimers or age restrictions on this. People know, right, one way or another, that this is supposed to be an adult game for adult players. Vampire has always aspired to be art, to bring the crafts of storytelling and mature themes and so on to the tabletop. But in order to do that, you have to have the courage of your convictions. You have to go all out. You can't allow yourself to be censored to the degree that they have been. You can't allow your spine to be stolen in the way that they have allowed it to be stolen. So this half-assed approach, shying away from the consequences of the narrative, is everything that is wrong with the current role-playing industry. Zang. At the end of World War II, the Axis and the Allies went to war with A-bombs until nobody was left to fight. In this atomic wasteland, a new breed of rockabilly hero arises. From the gleaming domes of Science City Zero to the sleazy roller derbies of Vegas and the sky fortress of the Fourth Reich, there's a new world for the taking. 45, Psychobilly Retropocalypse. Available at lulu.com and RPG Now.
Fully comprehensive, to thee we give our thanks. The scribe